for the individual. It is within our grasp to eliminate age-old pathologies, not just things like hunger, which we can do with technology, but aberrations in the human spirit, products of our primordial limbic system, things like war. So we proliferate suggestions such as pacifism or peace studies, that wars take place not because one side is 51% in the right and the other is 49%, or not because somebody wants something that they otherwise shouldn't, but the idea that it's simply a miscommunication. So we know, perhaps, that Mr. Ahmadinejad has a very antithetical view to Western liberality. And we know that his pronouncements are chilling indeed. He gave one the other day. But we do not want to apply that same standard that we would to George Bush. Remember when Mr. Putin was killing tens of thousands of people in Chechnya, and a French journalist suggested that that was a little bit over the top. If I could paraphrase in polite company, as I recall, Mr. Putin asked if that person would prefer a Russian type of castration, and that was the end of the conversation. The point being is that we assume under the tenets of utopian pacifism that other people cannot be judged by the same standards, because to do so might escalate a controversy into a war, and that we, with our great wisdom, it's very, I think, egocentric, and it suggests a certain sort of arrogance. We, with our greater resources, both intellectual and material, do not have to engage in the same type of language, or we don't have to apply the same standards, or our enemies are somehow misguided, that Mr. Ahmadinejad or people in Al-Qaeda in Iraq or Mr. Chavez are misguided. If we could just talk to them, we could just explain to them that they should govern their thoughts and their actions by reason rather than emotion, then we wouldn't have these disagreements. That has had a chilling effect because it prevents us as a society from saying what we want, and when people criticize us, judging them by the same standard that we do, and letting adversaries or people who disagree with us know that there's an absolute standard that they're going to be held to the same way that we are. It's sort of an intellectual notion of deterrence, or intellectual preparedness, if I could use that phrase. And that, too, utopian pacifism has had a chilling effect on free expression. And in this sense, we have erred on the side of we have not provided collectively the individual a guarantee that he can say what he wants. Again, what I'm getting at is nobody says this by law or statute, but because constitutional governments reflect the majority opinion or the general prevailing sentiment of society at large, governments get the impression, they monitor public opinion, and therefore they do not guarantee us security of thought or encouragement for free exchange of ideas because of these prevailing ideologies. There's a third one that I'd like to also introduce. I guess I could call it, for want of a better word, again, moral equivalence. This is the notion that there shall be no magnitude in assessing a Western misdemeanor. They shall be the versus of the felony of some person outside the West, that they are morally equivalent. What would that mean? We can have 2,000 terrorist incidents in the United States each year committed by people who identify themselves as radical Islamicists in some such fashion. But we will continue to cite Timothy McVeigh and suggest that Christian extremism is of the same level of worry, not because they are, but because we want to find some mechanism that makes the non-West equal to the West, or the foreigner the same as ourselves. Or we've lost this notion of abstract methods of judgment and adjudication. We can say that, and we did say this, that Abu Ghraib was analogous to the Gulag or the Stali. And why can we say that? Because no one was killed there, where we know in the other two cases millions of people died. It does not matter. For the Westerner, if we are not perfect, we cannot be good. And the moral equivalent doctrine suggests that it doesn't matter what our misdemeanors are, the fact that they exist. Again, this is part of the arrogance of the Enlightenment. Mere fact that they exist means that somehow that we've failed, that we've disappointed ourselves, and we have not been able to attain that mythical idea of intellectual and moral perfection. We saw it with Guantanamo. nobody's been killed at Guantanamo, but we talked about that as part of the archipelago of American detention centers. Again, whatever one's feelings are about Guantanamo, we should have the ability to assess that on an absolute standard and compare it to other things in history and come to a conclusion whether it's barbarous or necessary or whatever one's views are about it. But in the world of the moral equivalent thinker, everything is of equal value. We give no deference to context. This philosophy, too, has had a chilling effect on free speech. So that if someone is worried that it's unsafe or it's ill-advised to draw a cartoon, then we can suggest that publishing a cartoon is somewhat the equivalent of an American saying something very terrible about Islam or going into Afghanistan. If we go into Afghanistan after 9/11, that's the same thing as the Soviets going into Afghanistan. Our purposes may be much different, but the very fact that you went into Afghanistan as a foreign country, forget the context, is equivalent. So when we look at incidents, why would somebody threaten a priest or a nun after the Pope's speech? Why would somebody try to blow up the Danish embassy? Why would somebody suggest that you can't write a novel and, in at least a metaphorical sense, criticize Islam? Why? Because you can always find something that a Westerner has done that will be the equivalent if you get away from context. Let me conclude. What I would suggest to you is after 9/11, this age-old tension between freedom and security had always been defined in terms of fear of the government infringing upon the individual, or in the contrast, the individual's freedom turning into license and leaving the society at large ill-prepared. But after 9/11, aside from the controversy about the Patriot Act or FISA protocols or Guantanamo, I think the disagreement, age-old as it was, metamorphosized into a new realm, and that was the individual himself and society in a collective sense itself put voluntary restraints on free expression. And this sent a message to liberal governments that they were not to err on the sides of protecting individual freedom and methods of expression, especially in places such as England or Holland, but rather for a variety of reasons that had predisposed society. They just simply were not morally or intellectually equipped any longer to do what they'd done in the past. Final question is, why did this happen? What is it within Western societies that makes it so prone to accept these ideologies of moral equivalence or utopian pacifism or multiculturalism? I could draw on a whole series of classical authors, especially Roman, one thinks here in this context, Tacitus, Suetonius, Juvenal, who all warned us about the ill effects of what they call luxus, just a fancy word for extreme leisure and affluence. The more the individual is wealthy, the more leisured he is, the harder it is for him to appreciate what was bequeathed to him by somebody else. And more importantly, a corollary of that is that the individual in the West always believes that whatever damage he does in the abstract will never be enough, given the wealth of his society, to impair the society at large. So you can berate a cartoonist, you can criticize the Pope in print, you can excuse someone from threatening Salman Rushdie, you can suggest that Reverend Wright was just talking like this, and all of these incremental damages won't really matter because we're of such wealth and power and influence and stability that we never think that we could endanger the very fabric of our society, forgetting that history tells us that these changes are incrementally, and decline doesn't come suddenly in one fell sweep, but it's incremental and gradual over generations. Again, going back to my original statement, I never thought that in my lifetime someone would have the audacity to address the NAACP and talk about the genetic basis for racial differences in learning acquisition and do so to a standing ovation. So I think that's a sign of how incrementally we have devolved because of these. There's another reason. I think also that one understands, even in the globalized world, there's a difference in the material circumstances between life in the West and life in the non-West. And Westerners who are affluent have various reactions to that. A good example was Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. The argument being made that our bounty is a result of an artifact of geography or of natural resources. So the Westerner, if he looks at something like Egypt and he sees that it was quite prosperous under the Ptolemies, he says, well, you see, Egypt was prosperous only because they had a river and they had good climate, not thinking that Egypt had been worn out by the 6th century BC, 5th century, because of bad farming practices under the end of the pharaohs, but completely revitalized, not because the climate had changed, but because it had adopted a Western form of agronomy under the Ptolemies. We could say the same thing in constant areas where the geography is similar, the climate is similar, but there's vastly different levels in the standard of living, predicated on the degree to which a society, I guess, we could say, became Western or not. These explanations, in other words, many Westerners don't find persuasive, or they find them chauvinistic. And one of the ways that you relieve this contradiction within yourself, I guess we could call it Western guilt, is that in the abstract, on things that you don't think are absolutely essential to your own life, you make concessions. You censor yourself, even though you know that Timothy McVeigh was not indicative of a society's or a religion's propensity to terrorism. You make that correlation with radical Islam, as if they're similar and morally equivalent, because it has a certain psychological satisfaction for yourself. What is its satisfaction? You don't have to make a great sacrifice in your own life. You don't have to give up the cocoon of Westernism when you can do it in the abstract. Some of the fiercest critics of Western civilization find these abstract outlets of expression, which they feel in the short term don't endanger their own privilege. In the long term, they're not so concerned about it. After all, take the fiercest critic of Western civilization and ask when abroad would they would rather be operated in Libya or be operated in New York? Or would they rather, if they were an atheist, would they say God is dead in Saudi Arabia or downtown Tehran, or would they do it in Washington? If they want to take their girlfriend to the beach, would she be better off having a string bikini in Los Angeles or in Tehran? We could go through these comparisons in the real world that everybody understands and they assume as a given, but they will not defend the difference, or they will not articulate the difference or remind us of the difference in the abstract. That too has been a precursor for these ideologies, which in turn have tended to make the Western individual censor his own modes of thought in a way that we haven't quite seen before. And we are starting to lose this precious symbiosis, I think, between security and freedom. Finally, let me finish by saying that there's always been a zeal within Western man for the romance of radical egalitarianism, a quality imposed on by result rather than a quality of opportunity. And yet we have seen the collapse in our own lifetime of communism, even of Marxism, and to some degree of socialism in Europe, as people are rethinking equality mandated by results. And one of the things that these ideologies do for the individual, they, in absence of a formal state apparatus that formally identifies itself as radically egalitarian, a utopian pacifist or somebody who believes in moral equivalence, or the multicultural, is essentially offering a worldview in which within this ideology everybody is going to be equal, there won't be differences, and that the West is essentially the same as the non-West due to some accidents in its past, or favorable geography, or some pernicious ancestors who stole or took something that was not their own. So it fills that political need as well. Let me just, and I will finish here, what is the ultimate result about this? I think if we were to look back at history, history gives no people a pass. As I suggested, we can't account for why Demosthenes' Athens could not do what Themistocles' Athens could do, or why Rome in 216 DC can lose 100,000 soldiers over 3 terrible battles at Trasimene and Cannae and the river Trebia. And yet, if you fast forward 700 years, Italy is now the Roman Empire of the world. The population has gone to 4 million to 70 million. It simply cannot keep out people by any military definition, would not pose the threat that Hannibal did to a much smaller Italy before. By any definition, the Wehrmacht in 1940 did not have the number of divisions and did not represent the threat of that horrendous German onslaught in February 1916 that almost overwhelmed but did not succeed at Verdun. In other words, ideas matter in a society that does not have confidence in its own